I worked the night shift, and something terrifying happened. It was the kind of night that felt like it had lasted forever. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I sat behind the desk, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The building was mostly empty, with only the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of papers to break the silence. I worked the night shift at a small, quiet office building, and though the night was usually uneventful, something felt off tonight. I checked the clock. 2:15 a.m. The last time I saw someone was around 9 p.m., and I hadn't heard from anyone since. No phone calls, no emails, just the faint sound of my own breath in the otherwise still office. As I leaned back in my chair, a cold shiver crawled down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't like a typical feeling you get when you're in a dark room and imagine someone lurking behind you. No, this was different. This was the kind of dread that gnawed at your insides, making your heart race for no logical reason. The faintest sound echoed from the hallway. Just a soft thud, almost imperceptible. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I strained my ears, trying to make out any other sounds, but the hallway remained silent. I told myself it was nothing. Probably just a loose board or something falling from a shelf. But then it came again. A slow, deliberate thud, followed by a slight dragging sound. My eyes darted to the hallway. I was alone. The building was supposed to be locked down tight, and the security cameras were all working fine. There was no reason for anyone to be here. I stood up and walked to the door of the office, cautiously peering out into the dimly lit corridor. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if they were moving by themselves. I scanned the area for any sign of life, but all I saw were the empty cubicles, the quiet office doors, and the dim light that barely illuminated the space. I swallowed hard, taking a hesitant step forward. And that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood. It was just a silhouette, but I could make out the shape of someone hunched over. They were facing the wall, motionless. The dragging sound was louder now, like the scraping of something heavy being pulled along the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I didn't want to move, didn't want to acknowledge what I was seeing, but the figure was unmistakably real. I called out, my voice trembling. "Hello? Is someone there?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, frozen, as if it hadn't heard me. I took another step forward, each movement heavy, my feet dragging across the floor as though the very air around me had thickened. "Hey," I said, louder this time. Still nothing. Just the dragging sound, slowly getting closer. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot. I was too afraid to move, to make any sudden action. And then I saw it. The figure's head turned, just slightly, enough for me to see its eyes. They were dark, hollow, lifeless. My breath caught in my throat, and before I could even process what was happening, the figure lunged forward, its face twisting into a grotesque smile. I backed up, stumbling over my own feet, knocking into a chair. The sound of my panic broke through the eerie silence, but it only seemed to fuel the thing behind me. I ran. My feet slapped against the floor as I bolted toward the nearest exit, my mind a blur of terror. I didn't dare look back. I could hear the sound of dragging footsteps growing louder, closer. It was gaining on me. The exit door was locked. My hands fumbled with the key, my panic intensifying as I heard the sound of those footsteps getting closer and closer. I had to get out. I had to escape. Finally, the door swung open and I dashed into the parking lot, gasping for breath. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. But as I started the engine and drove away, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A dark shape standing by the building, watching. To this day, I don't know what it was. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me after too many hours on shift? Or was someone, truly there, waiting for me to make a mistake? The next day, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. The image of the dark figure, its hollow eyes, and that unnatural dragging sound haunted me every time I closed my eyes. But I had to go back to work. I couldn't just leave, even though the thought of stepping foot inside that building made my skin crawl. I arrived early, hoping the sunlight would somehow ease my nerves. The office was quiet, as expected, with only a few of the usual early risers starting to trickle in. I passed by the hallway where I'd seen the figure the night before. It looked so normal in the daylight. Bland, sterile, like any other office space. But the memory of what had happened felt like a weight pressing down on me. I tried to go about my day as usual, focusing on my tasks and pushing the fear to the back of my mind. But by lunchtime, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to check the security footage. Maybe it would provide some answers, or at least reassure me that I wasn't losing my mind. I made my way to the security room where the monitors blinked with various camera feeds from around the building. The room was empty, except for the dim hum of the machines. I sat down in front of the screen and rewound the footage from last night, starting around 2 a.m. At first, everything seemed normal. The hallways were empty. The building was silent, just as I remembered. But then, as I watched, my blood ran cold. There, in the corner of the screen, I saw the figure. It was subtle at first, just a faint outline in the shadows, but it was unmistakable. The dragging sound I had heard? It was captured on the footage. The figure was moving, slowly, its back hunched over, dragging something behind it. I froze. It wasn't just standing there. It was coming closer, moving down the hallway, and the sound grew louder, more distinct. The figure came closer to the camera's view. And then, it stopped. I watched, heart racing as the figure stood motionless, staring at the camera. Or was it the hallway? The screen flickered for a moment, and then something strange happened. The figure turned, but not in a natural way. It was as if its body moved at an odd angle, jerking unnaturally, like it was disconnected from reality. That's when I heard it. The voice. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, like a whisper through static. But it grew clearer as I listened. "Help me. Please. You're next." Panic surged through me, and I frantically scrolled through the rest of the footage, but it was all the same. Every other camera feed was clear, except for that one hallway. I stared at the blank screen, my mind a whirlwind. There was no way this was just a technical glitch. Someone, or something, had been in the building with me. Something real. My phone rang, pulling me from my thoughts. It was my manager. "Hey, everything all right?" he asked, his voice casual. I tried to sound calm, but I could barely manage a coherent response. "Yeah, just checking on some stuff from last night." He didn't seem to notice anything was off. "Well, I'm going to need you to stay late tonight. We've got some reports due, and I'm counting on you to finish them." The thought of staying another night in that building, knowing what I had just seen on the footage, made my stomach turn. I wanted to refuse, to scream, but I couldn't afford to lose my job. "I'll stay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That night, I prepared myself for the worst. I made sure to check every door, every window, every camera feed. The building seemed eerily quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. I had the distinct feeling that something was watching me, just out of view. As the clock ticked past midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront the thing. I would find the source of the strange occurrences and make sense of it all. I grabbed a flashlight, and despite the pounding in my chest, I walked toward the hallway where the figure had appeared. The shadows stretched longer than usual as I stepped into the corridor. My flashlight flickered as I walked further, and the familiar, ominous dragging sound echoed through the space. I wasn't alone. The figure was there again, standing just ahead, hunched over, its face still hidden in the shadows. But this time, it moved. Slowly, deliberately, dragging something behind it. I took a deep breath, forcing my legs to move forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. It was a scream. The lights went out, and I was plunged into darkness. The darkness was suffocating, a thick, oppressive blanket that seemed to swallow everything around me. My heart raced, and I couldn't hear anything but the rush of blood in my ears. I froze, my flashlight now useless in the black void, my hands trembling as I held it up, uselessly searching for any sign of light. Then, a sound. Soft at first, like a faint breath, then a scraping noise. That dragging sound. It was closer now. Too close. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, my breath shallow. I knew that whatever had been following me, whatever had been in the building with me, was now right behind me. My skin crawled as I felt a presence, a cold breath against the back of my neck. I spun around, the flashlight beam flickering wildly. It landed on a shape. Someone. The figure was standing there, but this time it was different. Its face was no longer hidden in shadow. It was gaunt, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into my soul, its mouth twisted in a silent scream. The dragging sound was louder now, as though it was right on top of me. But I couldn't see what it was dragging. It reached out. I tried to back away, but my legs felt like lead, unresponsive, trapped in place. My breathing was ragged, each gasp cutting through the thick silence of the hallway. The figure's hand was closer now, its long, bony fingers reaching for me, and I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. And then it spoke. "Help me," it whispered, its voice not quite human, more like a broken echo. "You have to help me, before it takes you too." My mind was a swirl of panic and confusion. What was it talking about? Who was it? What did it want from me? In a flash, the flashlight died completely, plunging me into darkness once more. But before I could even think to run, the air shifted. Frosty, cold. So cold that I could see my breath misting in front of me, despite it being an otherwise warm night. I felt the figure move toward me, its presence almost suffocating now, and the dragging sound grew louder, as though it was getting closer with each passing second. Suddenly, the hallway light flickered back on, harsh and bright, blinding me for a moment. And when I could finally make out the surroundings again, the figure was gone. The hallway was empty. I looked around frantically, heart pounding, but nothing moved. The dragging sound had stopped. The air was no longer cold. I slowly backed up, my breath still coming in shallow gasps, and turned to leave. But as I walked, a sudden thought struck me. What if it wasn't over? Just as I reached the exit door, something caught my eye. A single sheet of paper crumpled on the floor. It hadn't been there before. My pulse quickened as I bent down to pick it up, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. Written in a jagged, uneven handwriting were the words, "You are the next." The ink was smudged in places as if it had been written in a rush. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt that same cold presence return, creeping over me, settling in my chest like a weight. I was being watched. It wasn't over. It had followed me, and now it was coming for me. Before I could even react, I heard it again. Soft at first, then louder. The dragging sound. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. The figure was there again, standing at the far end of the hallway, its hollow eyes locked onto mine once more. But this time, it wasn't alone. A second figure appeared beside it, then another. More emerged from the shadows, slowly, one after another, their hollow eyes all fixed on me. I turned and ran. This time, I didn't stop to question whether it was real. I didn't care if it was all in my head. All I knew was that I had to get out, or I would never leave this building alive. The light, it opened. I burst outside into the cold night air, gasping for breath. But the moment I stepped into the parking lot, I heard it. The scraping noise. Months have passed since I ran from that building, but the terror has never fully left me. Every night I hear it. The dragging sound, faint but unmistakable. It's always there, lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness, waiting for me to sleep, waiting for me to be vulnerable. It's as if whatever haunted that building has followed me home, and I can feel its presence creeping into my every waking moment. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, the result of too many sleepless nights and too much stress. But no matter how many lights I leave on or how tightly I lock the doors, the fear never truly subsides. I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. One evening, after weeks of avoiding it, I finally decided to face the truth. I had to go back. I had to return to that building to uncover what had happened that night. I had to know if it was real, or if I was just losing my mind. But more than that, I had to stop running. The fear had consumed me for too long, and I couldn't live like this anymore. I parked in front of the building, staring at it for a long time. It seemed different somehow, as though it was no longer the same place I had worked in before. The windows were dark, and the building felt strangely hollow, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for me. I walked toward the entrance, my footsteps echoing in the empty parking lot. I hesitated before I reached for the door handle, but something inside me pushed me forward. I stepped inside, and the chill of the air hit me like a wall. The building was just as silent as I remembered it, but this time it felt off. It felt like it was alive, as though the walls themselves were watching me. So I moved down the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. The lights above flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. I could hear my breath, shallow and quick, as I walked further into the corridor. The space felt more expansive now, as if the walls had shifted and grown while I was away. The familiar layout was now unrecognizable, the hallway stretching further than I ever remembered. And then I heard it. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me, distant but unmistakable. Slowly, the sound grew louder, closer. It was standing at the end of the hallway, its back to me. But this time it was different. Its posture wasn't hunched anymore. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form towering above the usual height of a person. It was motionless, its face turned away, but I could feel its gaze on me. I could feel it watching, waiting. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, as though I had become part of the darkness, trapped in its pull. The figure began to turn, its head slowly tilting to face me. I could see its eyes now, hollow, empty voids like black pits. But what made my stomach churn wasn't just the emptiness in its gaze. It was the smile, that twisted, cruel grin that stretched far too wide, far too impossibly wide. "Why did you come back?" the figure whispered. Its voice was distorted, layered with static, like a broken recording. "You should have stayed away." I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. My body was frozen, locked in place as the figure took another step closer. The dragging sound now seemed to fill the entire hallway, reverberating off the walls. The chains behind it rattled, and I could hear the scraping sound more clearly now. There was something else being dragged. It wasn't just objects, it was people. There were bodies, pale, lifeless bodies, being dragged across the floor behind it. Some were still in the same clothes they'd worn on their last day of work. Others were barely recognizable. But all of them had the same hollow eyes, the same empty expressions, staring out into nothingness. "Help them," the figure whispered again. "Help them, and you'll join us." It was too much. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything, but there was no sense to be made. This was beyond reality, beyond anything I could understand. I managed to take a step back, then another, my legs finally responding as the primal urge to flee overtook me. The figures watched me, but they didn't move. They didn't need to. I could feel the weight of their gaze, the unspoken threat, and the creeping inevitability that I had made a fatal mistake by coming here. I ran. I didn't stop. Not until I was outside, in the rain, gasping for breath, trembling from head to toe. The building stood there behind me, silent once again as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew that it wasn't over. Something had followed me home that night. Something I had awakened when I stepped foot into that building again. And now, no matter where I go, I can feel it. The dragging, the whispers, they are always there, waiting. I thought I was free. I thought that the moment I left that building, I'd finally left the nightmare behind. But I was wrong. Whatever had followed me that night, whatever had been awakened when I dared return, was not done with me. It was only just beginning. For weeks after I left the office, I tried to move on. I changed my phone number, moved to a new apartment, and even started a new job. Anything to break the connection to that place, to that thing that haunted me. But the nightmares never stopped. Every night I was back in that hallway, facing the figure with the hollow eyes and the dragging chains. Each time I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, my body trembling with fear. And then, one night, it happened. I woke up to the sound of dragging. It was soft at first, like a distant whisper, but it grew louder, closer. My eyes shot open, and for a moment, I convinced myself I was still dreaming. But as I listened, I realized this was real. The dragging sound was coming from inside my apartment. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the familiar chill in the air, the same cold I had felt in the building, the same presence. I slowly turned toward the door, and there, in the darkness, I saw it. It was standing in the doorway of my bedroom, barely visible in the low light of the hallway. But I could feel it, just as I had felt it that night in the office. Its presence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. The hollow eyes locked onto mine, and the dragging sound intensified, growing louder with each passing second. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. My body was paralyzed, as though it had been trapped in some kind of supernatural hold. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The figure didn't move toward me, not yet, but I could feel it waiting. The same sickening grin spread across its face, its mouth stretching impossibly wide as it whispered, "You came back. You never should have left." The dragging stopped. But the silence that followed was even worse. It hung in the air like a thick fog, pressing down on me, suffocating me. The figure stood still, its eyes unblinking, unfeeling. And then I heard it again, the faint sound of scratching, coming from somewhere behind the figure. It was soft at first, like the scurrying of rats, but it grew louder, closer. The figure turned its head slightly, as if acknowledging the sound, but its gaze never left me. It raised its hand, and in a voice that was almost too quiet to hear, it spoke. "Not just you. Not just you alone." The door behind the figure creaked open. It wasn't my imagination. The door was opening by itself, as though something or someone was pushing it from the other side. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. And then the first thing appeared. A pale, lifeless hand, slipping through the crack in the door, fingers curled like claws, scraping against the wood. I tried to move. I tried to scream, but the figure's presence kept me frozen, unable to do anything but watch. More hands followed, reaching out of the doorway. Pale, ghostly hands that grasped at the air. At nothing. There were dozens of them, all emerging from behind the door, their long, thin fingers twitching as they clawed toward me. I could hear their whispers, voices, pleading, desperate. "Help us. Help us. You're one of us now." I didn't understand what it meant, but I could feel it. I was one of them now. The moment I had stepped foot into that building, I had opened the door to something far darker than I could ever have imagined. Something that had been waiting for the right moment to claim me, to drag me into the darkness. The figure stepped aside, allowing the hands to crawl closer. And then, from behind them, something stepped into the room. It was the last thing I expected to see. It was me. The thing that emerged from the doorway looked like me. It was a twisted, distorted version of me, but I could still recognize the features. The same eyes, the same face. Only this version of me was cold, lifeless. Its skin was ashen, its body sagging as if the life had been drained from it. Its smile was twisted, grotesque. It stepped forward, its hands reaching out toward me. And then I understood. I wasn't meant to escape. I was meant to become part of it. The figure, the dragging, the whispers. It was all part of something much older, much darker than I could comprehend. It wasn't after me alone. It was after everyone. The room began to spin. The walls closed in, the whispers growing louder, overlapping each other. The figure, the creature, my own distorted reflection, they were all closing in around me. In that moment, I understood what had happened in that building. The bodies I had seen dragged across the floor, the whispers that called to me. They weren't just victims. They were all me. All of them had been pulled in, claimed by the same darkness that had claimed the office building, the same thing that had followed me here. And now it was my turn. As the hands reached for me, my distorted self stepped closer, its grin widening impossibly. I could feel the coldness of its touch, the icy fingers brushing against my arm, dragging me toward the abyss. Help us, or become one of us. The last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was the dragging sound. And then, silence. The darkness was suffocating, cold, and absolute. It was all-encompassing, as though I was floating in an endless void, a place where time had no meaning, where nothing existed except for the suffocating weight of emptiness. I couldn't see, I couldn't move, and I couldn't hear. It was as if my body had ceased to exist altogether. But then, a whisper, soft at first, like a breath against my ear, cut through the silence. A voice, familiar yet distorted, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, the words echoing in my mind. It was my own voice, but twisted, warped by something malevolent, something ancient. Welcome to the other side. Suddenly, the darkness shifted. The cold began to retreat, replaced by a flicker of light, dim and flickering, but enough to reveal the surroundings. I found myself standing in a strange place, an eerie reflection of the office building. The walls were cracked and crumbling, as if the place had been abandoned for centuries. The air was thick, suffused with a heavy, stagnant smell, as if the building had been frozen in time. And yet, the presence was unmistakable. It was here. The darkness that had followed me, that had claimed me, was now my reality. And I wasn't alone. Around me, I could see them. Others. Figures, all twisted and distorted versions of people I had known. People I had seen before. Faces that were familiar, but somehow wrong. Eyes that were empty. Souls lost in the same abyss that now consumed me. They stood motionless, watching me. Silent. Waiting. And I knew, deep in my bones, that they were all once like me. People who had come, people who had been chosen by the thing that resided in this place. Now, we were all trapped in this horrific reflection of reality, bound to it, connected by the same darkness. You thought you could escape. It hissed, its voice a low rasp that rattled in my chest. But there is no escape. Not for you. Not for anyone who comes here. And do you know what we are? It asked, its voice filled with a strange, sickening satisfaction. We are the lost, the forgotten, the ones who came too close to the truth. We were once like you, alive, human. But now we are something else, something more. And so will you be. I struggled against the pull, but it was no use. The figure's presence was overwhelming, suffocating. It reached out with its cold hand, touching my chest, and in that instant, the coldness seeped into me. I felt my body tremble, my very essence being drained, pulled into something much darker, much older than I could ever have imagined. "Join us," it whispered, its voice a command. "Become part of the darkness. Embrace what you truly are." Suddenly, everything shifted. The building around me began to warp, to dissolve into a blur of shadows and light. I saw faces, so many faces, floating in the air, eyes wide in terror, mouths open in screams that I could not hear. They were trapped, just like me. Trapped in this purgatory, this nightmare of eternal darkness. With all the strength I could muster, I pushed back, summoning every ounce of willpower to break free from the figure's grip. I felt the chains that had bound me begin to crack, the darkness pushing against my resistance, but I refused to give in. "No," I screamed, though no sound escaped my lips. But in my mind, the word was clear. Strong. Defiant. I didn't know where I was running to, only that I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it claim me. Not like this. The air around me grew thicker, more oppressive, but I pushed forward. I ran through the empty halls, through the endless rooms, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing down on me. But every step I took, I could feel the chains loosening. The pull of the figure was weakening. The more I resisted, the more I fought. The more the world around me seemed to unravel. And then, as I rounded a corner, I saw it. The door. The exit. The one place that could lead me out of this hellish nightmare. I didn't hesitate. I ran straight for it, my heart racing, my mind screaming for freedom. I reached the door, and as I touched the handle, I felt it. The final tug, the last vestige of the figure's power trying to pull me back into the darkness. But I refused to let it take me. I threw open the door and stepped through. And just like that, I was back. I was no longer in the twisted reflection of the office building. I was standing outside, in the real world, the rain still pouring down, the night air cold against my skin. The darkness was gone. The dragging sound had stopped. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, still lingered. I could still hear the whispers, faint in the back of my mind, warning me that I wasn't truly free. The figure, the darkness, hadn't finished with me. It was still out there, waiting. And as I stood there, drenched in rain, I knew one thing for sure. I had escaped once, but it wouldn't be the last time it came for me. I thought I had escaped, but the truth was far worse than I had imagined. The darkness. It was not bound by walls, by dimensions, or by time. It had followed me back, quietly, like a shadow, and now it was within me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The whispers didn't stop. They filled my mind, every thought tangled with their cold, hollow voices. "You're not free," they would say. "You belong to us now." I tried to ignore them, to push them out. I threw myself into my daily routines, went to work, spoke to friends, but it was no use. At night, the figure would come back. Not in full force, but always lurking at the edges of my dreams. Always with that grotesque, stretched grin, those hollow eyes, and that dragging sound, growing louder as the darkness closed in. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Faces that melted into the walls. Whispers that taunted me from the darkness. My reflection in the mirror was never quite right. Sometimes I would catch myself smiling, my face twisted in a way I couldn't control. The eyes staring back at me weren't mine. That's when I knew. The darkness had infected me, woven itself into my very being. I wasn't me anymore. I was one of them. I tried everything I could think of to fight it. I went to therapists, tried meditation, drugs, even spiritual cleansings. But nothing worked. The more I fought, the deeper it dug into my soul. The whispers became louder, clearer. I could hear them in the back of my mind, even in the daylight, like a chorus of voices pulling me toward the darkness. Help them. Help us. Or join us. One evening, after weeks of torment, I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't bear the isolation, the constant dread, the feeling that I was being watched even when I was alone. I was losing myself to it. So I made a decision. I had to go back. I had to return to the building. But this time I knew what I had to do. I had to face the thing that had taken me, that had claimed me. I couldn't run from it anymore. I couldn't keep pretending I wasn't one of them. It was a stormy night when I found myself standing in front of the building again. The air was thick with fog, and the sky overhead seemed to be alive with flashes of lightning. The building loomed before me, its windows like empty eyes, dark and unwelcoming. My heart raced, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I pushed open the door, stepping into the darkness once again. This time, though, it didn't feel like an eerie, desolate place. It felt alive, as though the building itself was waiting for me. I walked down the long hallway, the same cold chill creeping into my bones, the familiar dragging sound echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. It was louder now, sharper, like the sound of chains being dragged across a metal floor. I followed it, drawn to it as if it was pulling me toward my destiny. And then, there it was. The figure. It stood at the end of the hallway just as it had before, but this time its presence felt different. It wasn't looming over me, waiting to consume me. It was me. I stood face to face with my twisted reflection. It was wearing my skin, my face, but it wasn't me. It smiled that grotesque smile again, the one that stretched impossibly wide, its hollow eyes gleaming with malice. "You finally understand," it whispered, its voice cold and full of twisted satisfaction. "You were always meant to be here. You belong to us. You're one of us." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The darkness had already consumed me long ago. The figure stepped aside, revealing the doorway behind it. There, standing in the shadow of the doorway, were hundreds, no, thousands of others. More faces, more people who had come and gone, lost in the darkness. They stared at me, hollow-eyed, their expressions empty and vacant. Some were still wearing the clothes they had died in. Others were dressed in the same tattered rags as the figure, but all had the same blank expression. They were me. I looked into the eyes of the nearest one. The person who had once been alive? Like me. And for the first time, I felt pity. For them, for myself, for everyone who had been claimed by this place. But then the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I felt the cold hands reaching for me, pulling me toward them. It was happening again. I was slipping, losing myself. I could feel my body weakening, my thoughts growing more distant, more alien. The darkness was pulling me into its embrace, its icy grip closing around my mind. But then something inside me snapped. I had a choice. I could embrace the darkness, become like them, be swallowed whole by the endless void. Or I could fight. I could resist, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been lost before me. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed back. I resisted the pull of the darkness. I shouted in my mind, even though I couldn't speak. "I won't become you." And slowly, painfully, the figure began to retreat, the other lost souls fading into the darkness. The hallway started to collapse, the walls shifting and crumbling, the building itself coming apart at the seams. The dragging sound stopped. The whispers faded. For a moment, it felt like the battle was over. But I knew it wasn't. I wasn't free. The darkness didn't just live in the building, it lived inside me. It had already taken root. And though I had driven it back, I had no illusions. It would always be there, waiting, watching. As I stood there in the ruins of the building, I knew I hadn't won. Not yet. But I was still fighting. And I would keep fighting, because I couldn't let it take me. Not now. Not ever again. The building was collapsing around me, the walls cracking and groaning as if they were alive, struggling to hold themselves together. The cold air rushed through the broken windows, carrying with it the heavy scent of decay and death. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it drowning out everything else. The figure, the dark thing that had haunted me, was gone, for now, but its presence lingered like a shadow in the corners of my mind. I could feel it, the weight of it, the pull, the darkness. I staggered through the crumbling hallways, barely able to keep my feet beneath me. Each step felt heavier than the last, my body weakening, my thoughts growing more distant, as though I was being torn between two worlds. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on, but I knew one thing for sure. If I stayed here, I would never leave. The darkness would claim me, body and soul. The exit was near. I could see the door at the far end of the hallway, bathed in the pale light of the dying storm outside. But as I moved toward it, I heard it again. The dragging sound. Slow, steady, growing louder, closer. It wasn't the sound of chains anymore. It was the sound of footsteps. My footsteps. I looked down in horror as my own reflection appeared in the glass of the door, standing behind me, its movements mirroring mine. But it wasn't me. Not anymore. It had my face, my body, but its eyes were empty, hollow, devoid of any trace of humanity. I froze. The figure wasn't gone. It had never left. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice coming from everywhere, wrapping around me like a vice. "You've already joined us." I spun around, but it was too late. The darkness erupted from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself, swallowing the light, drowning everything in its cold embrace. The building seemed to collapse inward, folding into itself like a black hole, pulling me deeper and deeper into its endless void. I screamed, but the sound was consumed, drowned out by the suffocating silence that followed. The last thing I saw was my own distorted reflection, its smile wide and cruel, before the darkness overwhelmed me completely. I never made it out, and we would never be free.